What if your father wasn't just a famous Hollywood director? What if he wasn't just the man who helped shape American pop culture, but the man who also shattered your family behind closed doors? What if your sister tried to tell you something too horrifying to process, and years later, you realized it was true? These aren't lines from a movie script. This is Jake Reiner's reality, and the world just found out. Jake Reiner, the soft-spoken journalist and former sports anchor, just dropped a truth bomb so massive it has sent shockwaves through Hollywood, law enforcement, and the entire Reiner family legacy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He says his own father, yes, Rob Reiner, forced himself on Jake's sister, Romy Reiner. And even more disturbing, Jake claims he was forced to watch. Let that sink in. The man millions adored for directing The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, and A Few Good Men, is now at the center of the most horrifying family scandal in Hollywood history. A scandal that exploded just days after Rob and his wife, Michelle, were found brutally murdered in their Brentwood estate. Stabbed. Repeatedly. Blood everywhere. No forced entry. And guess who lived in the guest house? Nick Reiner. The youngest. The most troubled. The son everyone forgot about until now. But this isn't just a story about a double murder. It's a story about secrets. About trauma. About what happens when fame covers up the rot inside. It's a story of a sister who cried for help, a brother who walked away, and another who may have taken justice into his own hands. And it all started long before the blood hit the walls. Jake Reiner has stayed silent for years. Quiet, distant, avoiding press, walking away from the Hollywood scene altogether. Most assumed he just didn't want the spotlight. Turns out, he was trying to survive in the shadows of a family that looked picture-perfect on the red carpet and utterly monstrous in private. He finally spoke up, and when he did, he didn't just speak. He detonated. In a podcast interview that's now been deleted from every major platform, but lives on in fragments across Reddit, X, and Telegram, Jake painted a picture of his childhood so disturbing it's hard to believe it was real. And yet, every day, new pieces of the puzzle keep emerging. Pieces like the burned diaries recovered behind a false wall in Romy's room, an unsigned second will with Rob's handwriting, a chain of VHS tapes marked private, do not view, and perhaps most damning, Romy's own statement to detectives, whispered as she stood over her parents' lifeless bodies. You need to look at Jake. He saw everything. How did it come to this? Why is Jake coming forward now? What really happened inside that Brentwood estate? And did Nick Reiner, the forgotten child, commit an act of revenge, or was he framed by someone with even darker motives? These questions form the beating heart of this investigation. Because make no mistake, this is no simple tabloid drama. This is about generational abuse. It's about how silence breeds monsters. And it's about what happens when one son refuses to stay quiet any longer, no matter the cost. You think you know the Reiner family? You don't. Not yet. Let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to the night it all changed. Let's go back to the night Brentwood died. How does a Hollywood mansion become a crime scene soaked in blood? You'd think a $13.5 million estate in Brentwood would be a sanctuary, a safe zone, the kind of place where you sip wine on the balcony and wave to the hummingbirds, where scandals stay on the studio lots, and the family photos are framed in gold. But on the night of December 3rd, everything inside the Reiner mansion burned. Not with fire, with betrayal, blood, and screams that shattered a silence no one knew had been festering for years. It started with a phone call. At 10:43 p.m., the LAPD dispatch center received a frantic 911 call from a young woman identified as Romy Reiner, 27, daughter of legendary director Rob Reiner. The dispatcher couldn't make out her words at first. Her voice was high-pitched, broken, like someone had just crawled out of a nightmare with their lungs on fire. All they caught clearly was, "They're dead. Oh my God, he did it. He did it. I told you he was dangerous." Within 5 minutes, 2 cruisers were speeding toward the gated Brentwood compound. What they found when they arrived was not just another Hollywood overdose or domestic dispute. This wasn't a publicity cleanup operation. This was war. The front door was wide open. No sign of forced entry. The lights in the hallway flickering. A trail of blood smeared like someone had been dragged. Or chased. Inside the main living room, sprawled across the Persian rug, were the lifeless bodies of Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70. Both had suffered multiple stab wounds. Blood had soaked through Rob's gray cardigan. Michelle's hand was still clutching a shattered wine glass. The forensics report would later label the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries. But that sterile language didn't capture the full picture. The walls told a different story. One officer described it later as like stepping into a painting done in panic, rage, and red. But perhaps most shocking, there were no signs of struggle from either of them. No overturned furniture. No defensive wounds. They hadn't even run. So who had the motive? Who had the access? And more importantly, who knew what was coming? That's where Nick Reiner enters the picture. The youngest of the three Reiner children, Nick, 32, lived in the guest house behind the main estate. While Romy had pursued a modest acting and writing career, and Jake had vanished into journalism and silence, Nick had spent the last decade spiraling, in and out of rehab, mental health programs, and court-mandated therapy. He was known to the LAPD. Small-time incidents. Paranoia. One arrest for public disturbance outside a club in Silver Lake. He was the kind of guy people dismissed as just going through something. But on this night, Nick was no longer background noise. When officers searched the property, they found Nick in the guest house, sitting on the couch. Shirtless, barefoot, covered in blood. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a bowl of cereal. As calmly as if nothing had happened, he looked up and said, "They finally shut up. Can you hear that? It's quiet now." Was this a confession? A psychotic break? Or something else entirely? Detectives would later say Nick seemed present, not detached. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't ask about his parents. In fact, he didn't say another word the rest of the night. When the officers asked about Jake, where he was, what he knew, Nick just smiled. Jake knows everything. Always has. That line changed the tone of the investigation instantly. Because until that moment, Jake Reiner hadn't been a suspect. He'd been a ghost. Meanwhile, Romy wasn't waiting for the police to connect the dots. She was already in an ambulance, sobbing uncontrollably. According to first responders, she kept whispering the same sentence over and over. I told them he was dangerous. I told them years ago, but she didn't clarify who he was. Not then. Not yet. Later that night, after being sedated and treated for shock, Romy sat down in a quiet room at Cedars-Sinai with two detectives. A single camera recorded the interview. The room was dim. Her face was pale, smudged with dried blood on her cheek. And then, with a shaky voice and eyes darting in every direction, she dropped the first of many bombs. Check the basement. That's all she said. No elaboration. No accusations. But it sent a ripple through the department. Because according to the property maps filed with the city, there was no basement in the Reiner estate. What was she talking about? A hidden room? A panic shelter? A personal theater? The next morning, detectives returned with forensic scanners and heat mapping gear. Behind a sealed wall in the wine cellar, they found a door. A heavy metal one. It hadn't been touched in years, judging by the dust, or so they thought. But on the floor, someone had recently dragged something heavy. There were deep scuffs. A trail. Inside, a room. Small. Cold. With a camera mounted on the ceiling. And a chair. Just one chair. Strapped with faded leather cuffs. The officers didn't say what else was in the room that morning, but their faces reportedly told the whole story. Back at the precinct, detectives reviewed the estate's surveillance footage. The front gates showed no entry before or after 9:12 p.m. No suspicious vehicles. No break-ins. But one camera. The one facing the hallway outside Rob and Michelle's bedroom showed a shadow at 9:17 p.m. A tall figure, moving slowly, dragging something. But here's the twist. The figure wasn't Nick. It wasn't Jake either. And it wasn't Romy. It was someone else. A fourth presence. Someone the family didn't talk about publicly. And that revelation would shake the entire narrative apart. But before we get to that, there was something else. Something found under Rob Reiner's body. Folded. Tucked into his sweater pocket. A note. Handwritten. 3 words. I saw everything. Signed, J.R. Who left the note? Why was it tucked into a pocket instead of left out in the open? Was it Jake's way of warning someone? Confessing? Or was someone trying to frame him? And most disturbingly, why did Romy say that Jake had seen it all, and done nothing? The answers weren't in the headlines. They were in Jake's mind. A mind fractured by trauma, haunted by memory, and silenced for decades. Until now. Because Jake Reiner was about to speak up. And when he did, he didn't whisper. He roared. But what he revealed next would rip this family's secrets wide open, and no one saw it coming. What would it take for a man who's been silent for decades to finally speak? Money wouldn't do it. Fame wouldn't. Not even revenge. For Jake Reiner, it took blood on a carpet, a handwritten note he didn't remember writing, and the sudden realization that if he stayed quiet any longer, the story would be told without him. And it would be told wrong. Jake Reiner had disappeared years earlier. Quietly. No farewell tour. No bitter interviews. One day he was a promising young journalist with a famous last name, and the next he was gone. Off the grid, out of Hollywood, out of reach. Most people assumed he couldn't handle the pressure. The truth? He couldn't handle the memories. When news of the Brentwood murders broke, reporters scrambled to find Jake. They called old numbers. They emailed dead inboxes. They knocked on doors that never opened. For 2 days, nothing. Then, on the third night, a low-quality video surfaced online. No studio, no makeup, no media filter, just Jake. Sitting alone in a dimly lit room, eyes sunken, beard untrimmed, hands shaking as if he hadn't slept in days. The video was titled simply, "I'm done being quiet." The first thing Jake said wasn't an accusation. It was a question. "What do you do?" he asked, staring straight into the camera. "When the people who were supposed to protect you teach you how to stay silent instead?" The internet froze. This wasn't the tone of a grieving son. This wasn't rage. This was exhaustion. Jake didn't mention the murders at first. He didn't say his father's name. He didn't even say Romy's name. Instead, he talked about childhood. About being told that some doors stay closed. Some conversations don't leave the house. Some truths are too complicated for the outside world. He talked about growing up in a house where success was loud and pain was managed quietly. Then he paused, took a breath, and said the line that would ignite everything. "I was a witness long before I was a survivor." What did he mean by that? At first, people thought he was speaking metaphorically. Trauma by association. Emotional neglect. The cost of fame. But Jake wasn't talking in metaphors. He reached off camera and pulled something into frame. A notebook. Old. Weathered. The corners bent like it had been carried too many miles. "This," he said, "is why I left." He opened it. Page after page filled with handwriting. Frantic, uneven, sometimes barely legible. Dates stretched back more than 20 years. Some entries were crossed out so aggressively the paper had torn. Jake didn't read them aloud. He didn't have to. He just said, "These are things I wasn't supposed to remember." And then came the contradiction that made everyone lean in. "People keep asking why I didn't say something sooner," he continued. "What they don't understand is, I didn't know what I was seeing back then. I only knew it felt wrong." Wrong. That word hung in the air. Wrong could mean a lot of things. But the way Jake said it, it meant something else. Jake finally addressed the night of the murders near the 15-minute mark. He admitted he'd been in the city earlier that week. Admitted he'd visited the estate days before everything happened. Then he said something that sent chills down everyone's spine. "I left because I was scared of what would happen if I stayed." Not scared for himself. Scared of what staying might unleash. Jake described a conversation he had with Romy just 4 days before the murders. They hadn't spoken properly in years. Their relationship had always been strained. Not hostile, just distant. Like two people who shared memories neither could name out loud. She called him late at night. He almost didn't answer. "I should have answered sooner," he said. "That's something I'll live with forever." According to Jake, Romy didn't waste time on small talk. She cried. For a long time. So hard he thought the call might disconnect. Then she said something that made his chest go cold. "You remember the room," she told him. Jake froze. "I didn't," he said in the video. "Or at least, I told myself I didn't." But Romy remembered. She reminded him. A locked space. A rule not to talk. A feeling of being watched. Jake admitted that as she spoke, memories came flooding back. Not in order, not clearly, but violently. Smells. Sounds. The hum of a camera, he never questioned. "I hung up after that call," he said quietly. "And I threw up." The internet reacted instantly. Some believed him immediately. Others accused him of spinning a narrative to save himself. A few even suggested the video was a calculated distraction, a way to redirect blame away from Nick. Jake anticipated that. That's the problem with silence, he said. When you finally break it, everyone thinks you're lying. He denied harming anyone. Denied being present the night of the murders. But he didn't deny something else. I saw things, he said. Things I didn't understand at the time. Things I wasn't supposed to survive. That line triggered a flood of responses from people who claimed similar experiences. Survivors. Former insiders. People who said powerful families don't collapse overnight. They rot slowly. And then someone noticed something odd. Midway through the video, when Jake shifted in his seat, his sleeve rolled up. There were scars on his forearm. Long parallel. Self-inflicted. The comment sections exploded. Why had no one noticed Jake's pain before? Because Hollywood doesn't reward broken witnesses. It rewards silence. Jake revealed he'd tried therapy. Multiple times. Different cities. Different names. Each time, he'd stop going once the questions got too close to the truth. He said one therapist told him something that haunted him. Children who witness trauma often believe they participated in it. That belief had eaten him alive. I blamed myself, Jake admitted. For not stopping it. For not screaming. For not understanding what I was seeing. He said he spent years trying to convince himself it had all been misinterpreted. That adults don't do what his memory suggested. That families don't hide rooms. But then the police found the basement. And everything snapped into focus. Jake ended the video with a warning. Not to the public. To the people watching who knew exactly what he was talking about. There are things you buried, he said. Things you assumed would die with them. He leaned closer to the camera. They won't. The video cut out abruptly. No goodbye. No explanation. Within an hour, it was gone from every major platform. Taken down for violations. But the damage? Already done. Behind the scenes, detectives were scrambling. Jake was no longer just a grieving son or a background witness. He was now central to the case. They pulled his old records. His therapy history. His travel logs. His financials. What they found raised more questions than answers. Jake had withdrawn a large sum of cash 2 weeks before the murders. He'd also sent a single encrypted email to an unknown address with the subject line, "Are you ready to tell the truth?" No reply had been logged. Yet. And then came the final twist. Late that night, an anonymous source leaked a still image from one of the recovered tapes. Grainy. Time-stamped. It showed a teenage boy standing just inside the frame. Frozen. Watching something off camera. The boy was identified almost immediately. It was Jake. Younger. Terrified. And behind him, barely visible in the reflection of a glass panel, was Romy, who leaked the image. Why now? And if Jake really had seen everything, why was his name on a note found beneath his father's body? The answers were coming. But not from Jake. From the one person everyone had underestimated. Nick. Because while Jake was breaking his silence, Nick was preparing to break something else entirely. And what he would say next would change the entire case. And no one saw it coming. How do you rebuild a family that was never whole to begin with? That's the question investigators, journalists, and viewers around the world were forced to ask as the Reiner case deepened. And as Jake's video cast a long, disturbing shadow over what everyone thought they knew. The Reiners weren't just another Hollywood family. They were American royalty. A director whose films defined a generation. A wife who'd quietly steered philanthropic empires. Children who, at least in public, looked like extensions of the brand. Successful, composed, smiling when the cameras clicked. But behind those curated holiday cards and glowing magazine profiles, a history of cracks. Cracks that ran deep. Cracks no one wanted to see. Cracks that would eventually burst open, with blood, with screams, with accusations the world wasn't ready to hear. This chapter isn't about the murders. It's about the years before. The quiet tremors. The ignored whispers. And the clues left behind by a family collapsing in slow motion. Let's start with Jake, the so-called golden son. Privately educated. Sharp. Thoughtful. Clean-cut. He walked red carpets with his father, shook hands with senators, wrote op-eds in college that were praised for their nuance. But if you look closely, not at the headlines, but the spaces in between, you'll see something else. Jake's earliest writings were always centered around silence. One essay from his high school days, titled "The Things We Don't Say," reads almost like a premonition. Sometimes families don't keep secrets. Sometimes they are secrets. Another, published under a pseudonym at college, was a short story about a boy who finds a locked door in his basement. Inside is a room filled with photographs, none of which he remembers taking. That story ends with the boy burning the house down. No explanation, just fire. And yet, no one asked questions. Because Jake smiled when he was supposed to. He played the role. But quietly, his world was unraveling. Then there was Romy. Brilliant, creative, fragile. She dabbled in acting, but never fully embraced the spotlight. She wrote screenplays that remained unproduced, journals that remained unread, until now. Romy was the first to call out the cracks, long before the murders. Not publicly, but in her art. One of her unpublished scripts, titled Sanctuary, described a young girl growing up in a mansion where the cameras never stop rolling, even when the adults think no one is watching. There's a scene where the girl sits in front of a mirror and recites lines like their prayers. Don't tell. Don't cry. Don't ruin the story. Another line, scribbled in the margin. He says the camera loves me, but I don't love it back. Haunting, but dismissed. Industry execs who read her work reportedly called it too experimental, too personal, too dark. So she buried it, just like she buried everything else. And then there was Nick, the wild card, the problem, the mess. But was he really? Or was he just the only one who stopped pretending? Nick Reiner was never going to be the next Spielberg. He didn't want to be. What he wanted was escape. From the cameras. From the legacy. From the pressure. From whatever was eating him alive from the inside out. Multiple rehabs. Court-ordered therapy. A public meltdown at a festival after screaming, "They all lied," during a screening of his father's film. No one took him seriously. Just another Hollywood meltdown. Just another rich kid with issues. But Nick's therapy records, the ones leaked after his arrest, painted a very different picture. In one session, at age 17, he reportedly told his therapist, "They hurt her. And he told me I'd be next if I didn't shut up." Another note from the same year. Patient exhibits signs of complex PTSD, recurring night terrors, and extreme distrust of male authority figures, including family members. Why didn't anyone act on this? Because his last name was Reiner. Because money buys silence. Because image is everything. The house itself told part of the story, too. Investigators uncovered renovations made over a span of 20 years that didn't match any city filings. Walls moved. Spaces hidden. Rooms repurposed. One contractor, who asked to remain anonymous, admitted to installing a soundproof storage room beneath the library. He was told it was for archival film materials. But he remembers something odd. The instructions were incredibly specific. No cameras allowed during construction. A non-disclosure agreement thicker than most mortgages. And a cash bonus if he finished within 2 days. That was 2004. Romy would have been 6. Then came the nanny's journal. Discovered in a storage unit in West Hollywood. Her name was Maya Torres. Employed by the Reiners from 2003 to 2010. She died of an overdose in 2016. Her belongings were auctioned off. Inside an old shoebox, tucked between baby pictures and receipts, was a spiral-bound notebook. The entries were sparse. Some were just dates. Others were disturbing in their simplicity. Romy cried again. Said she didn't like quiet time with Dad. Jake asked if he had to go in the room again. Michelle said, "You know the rules." Nick wet the bed again. Refuses to sleep alone. They're not bad kids. They're scared. That last line was underlined. Twice. Why did Maya come forward? Because she didn't survive long enough. Or maybe because she knew no one would listen. Just like no one had before. As all of this was emerging, Jake did something unexpected. He released a second video. Not as long. Not as emotional. This time, he was angry. He held up a photo. It showed a much younger Jake, Romy, and Nick sitting on a couch. All 3 children were smiling. Behind them stood Rob, arms draped around their shoulders. But something was off. Zoomed in, you could see Jake's hand was clenched into a fist. Nick's face was turned slightly, flinching, and Romy's smile didn't reach her eyes. Jake stared at the image for a moment, then said, "This photo won a parenting award. I remember the day it was taken. We were told to smile, or else." He didn't clarify what or else meant. He didn't need to. The comments section filled in the blanks. And just when you thought it couldn't get darker, A private investigator hired by a third party leaked a voice message. It was allegedly from Michelle Reiner. The timestamp? 2 months before her death. In the recording, Michelle sounds agitated, almost frantic. I don't care what they remember. It's too late now. We should have stopped it years ago. But we didn't. And now they're all turning on us. You think Jake's the only one who kept notes. Then silence. Then a whisper. If Romy ever opens her mouth, we're finished. She never explained what they were finished for. But the world had already started answering that question for her. By the end of that week, the media narrative had changed. No longer a simple murder mystery. Now it was a generational horror show. A family legacy drenched in trauma. A facade crumbling under the weight of silence. A director who'd once filmed fairy tales now accused of living in a nightmare. And yet, even with all this noise, one voice had yet to be heard. Romy's. She had vanished from the public eye since the night of the murders. No interviews. No statements. No appearances. Until a tweet surfaced. From an unverified account. No photo. No bio. Just 4 words. He made us act. Was it her? No way to be sure. But it sounded like her. And if it was, then the performance might finally be over. But what Romy did next, away from the cameras, away from the police, would ignite the next explosion, and no one was prepared for the fallout. What do you do with the child no one wants to look at? You put him in the guest house. That's exactly what the Reiners did with Nick. Not in some cruel, dramatic fashion, not publicly, but quietly, subtly, like he just preferred the space, or needed time to work on himself. That's how they framed it. But the reality? Nick Reiner had been exiled from the family long before blood hit the walls. And yet somehow, on the night everything fell apart, he was right there. Not hiding, not running, just waiting. So the question became unavoidable. Did Nick kill his parents? Or was he the final witness to a horror no one else survived? Let's rewind. Nick Reiner was born into chaos. Not literal chaos, not at first. The tabloids called him a miracle baby. A fresh start for Rob and Michelle, who were already in their mid-40s when they had him. Their careers were slowing, their older kids were teenagers, and suddenly they had a second chance to get it right. But Nick never fit the mold. Where Jake was composed and curious, and Romy was artistic and observant, Nick was loud, wild, always testing limits. As a kid, he broke windows, climbed the roof, ran away from school. By 12, he'd been suspended twice. By 15, he'd been caught sneaking out with a bottle of whiskey and a girl 4 years older. The family solution? Send him to rehab. Not once. Not twice. 9 times. 9 different facilities by the age of 25. Some for drugs. Some for behavior. One for what Michelle described as emotional disturbances. The whispers said it all. He's unstable. He needs help. He's not safe to be around. But here's the twist. Not a single facility ever formally diagnosed Nick with schizophrenia, sociopathy, or violent tendencies. His most consistent diagnosis? Complex PTSD. So the question becomes, from what? A leaked intake form from one of the centers provided a clue. Under the section titled Family History, Nick had scrawled the words, "My family doesn't love me. They protect themselves." Asked to elaborate, he said, "There's a secret, a bad one, and they locked me up so I wouldn't talk about it." Most assumed he was being dramatic. But in light of what we now know, Romy's whispers, Jake's journals, the hidden basement, that line takes on a much more sinister meaning. Nick wasn't just an outcast. He was a prisoner of memory, and perhaps the only one willing to speak it out loud, until Jake finally did. Let's go to the night of the murders. Nick had been living in the guest house for 6 months. Technically, he wasn't supposed to be there. Rob and Michelle had tried to evict him twice in the previous year, but there were legal complications, mostly tied to the trust fund. Yes, Nick had a trust fund, but with conditions. He could access monthly stipends, only if he agreed to therapy and supervised living arrangements, which included the guest house. Essentially, they were paying him to stay quiet. But something changed in the days leading up to the murders. Nick stopped going to therapy. He stopped answering calls. Neighbors reported seeing him walking the perimeter of the property at night, barefoot, whispering to himself. One gardener claimed Nick told him, "The time's coming. They'll all pay for what they did." The gardener didn't report it. People say a lot of things in Hollywood. But that same gardener came forward later with a haunting statement. His eyes weren't angry. They were relieved, like he knew it was almost over. When officers found Nick in the guest house that night, it wasn't what they expected. No signs of a struggle, no frantic cleanup. He was watching cartoons, a bowl of cereal in his lap, blood on his hands, on his shirt, on the couch. When asked what happened, he just smiled and said, "It's finally quiet." That was enough to arrest him on the spot, but not enough to convict, because what came next shattered the timeline wide open. The forensics didn't match the story. The blood on Nick's clothes was, indeed, from Rob and Michelle, but the angle of the splatter, the pattern, suggested it wasn't from direct contact. It was from proximity. He'd been close to the crime, but he hadn't swung the knife. Then there was the security footage. At 9:17 p.m., a tall figure had been caught near the bedroom hall. But Nick? He was seen at 9:16 p.m. walking out of the kitchen toward the guest house, carrying a pizza box. The timestamp was verified. He couldn't have committed the murders, not unless he had an accomplice, or unless the killer was already inside. And that's when investigators started asking a darker question. Was Nick actually protecting someone? The first time Nick spoke after the arrest, it wasn't to the police. It was to Jake. In a holding cell, through a pane of scratched glass, Nick stared at his older brother for nearly 2 minutes without speaking. Then, finally, he leaned forward and said, "I didn't kill them, but I watched them die." Jake reportedly went pale. Nick continued, "It wasn't just Dad. It wasn't just Mom. It was all of it. You know what I mean. And you know it's your turn now." Then he hung up the phone. What did that mean? Was he threatening Jake? Or warning him? Was he angry that Jake had waited so long to speak up? Or was he scared that Jake would finally tell the whole truth? According to leaked reports, Nick also told his public defender a chilling detail. "I tried to stop it. I really did. But when the door opened, I froze. I always freeze." He refused to elaborate. But investigators soon learned that Nick's room, the guest house, had a direct camera feed from inside the main house. He had access to it. He could see what was happening, which meant he might have watched the murder in real time and done nothing. Or worse, he might have been told to. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A search of Nick's guest house revealed a burned barrel in the backyard. Inside, ashes. And in those ashes, investigators found remnants of fabric, possibly from a child's dress. They also found metal clasps, resembling restraints. But most disturbing, a charred photograph. The bottom half was destroyed, but the top showed Romy's face, young, smiling, and a hand on her shoulder. The hand was gloved. Investigators aren't certain who the hand belonged to, but Nick had reportedly been in possession of dozens of old family tapes. All gone now. Burned. Why? According to one officer, it looked like he was trying to erase something, or protect someone, or both. So was Nick the killer? Maybe. But the evidence was circumstantial. What we do know is this. He was there. He had blood on his hands. He burned materials tied to the family's history. And he made a cryptic confession no one fully understood. But we also know he didn't match the figure in the hallway footage. He had an alibi within the minute of the attack. And the DNA on the murder weapon didn't match his. That weapon, by the way, was a kitchen knife from the main house, wiped mostly clean, except for one thing. A fingerprint. Not Nick's. Not Romy's. Not Jake's. Someone else entirely. But the match wasn't announced publicly. Not yet. Because the investigation wasn't over. And Nick? He still had one card left to play. Because when the courtroom doors opened, and Nick took the stand, what he said shattered every version of the truth. And no one saw it coming. How do you separate the man from the myth, when the myth is all the world has ever seen? That was the question hanging over every camera lens, every news panel, and every shocked viewer as the Reiner story spiraled into darkness. Because this wasn't just about a murder. This was about a legacy, a name, Rob Reiner. To most of the world, that name meant warmth, nostalgia, laughter. He was meathead from All in the Family, the liberal lion of Hollywood, the director behind feel-good classics like The Princess Bride and Stand By Me. He marched for civil rights. He donated to progressive causes. He made movies that healed people. So how could that man, that icon, now be at the center of whispered horror, abuse allegations, and the unraveling of his own family? How could someone so beloved wear such a convincing mask for so long? Let's pull that mask off, piece by piece, and see what it was hiding. Let's start with the public persona. Rob Reiner was the ultimate Hollywood son who became the ultimate Hollywood father. Son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, Rob grew up with laughter in his DNA and cameras in his blood. He transitioned from actor to director with a fluidity that few could match, and critics hailed him as a generational voice of storytelling. By the 2000s, Rob had moved beyond film into activism. He championed gay marriage. He campaigned for children's rights. He stood up against bigotry, censorship, and right-wing extremism. And when he became a father himself, the media gushed. He was the new Hollywood dad. Photos of him kissing baby Romy on the cheek. Him pushing Jake's stroller through Central Park. Smiling. Always smiling. But if you take a closer look at those images, the ones people reposted after his death, you'll notice something subtle. None of the kids are smiling with him. Not truly. Romy's eyes always look off frame. Jake's body seems tense, even as a toddler. And Nick? He's barely in any of them. At the time, it meant nothing. But now, it screams. Insiders have started coming forward. Former assistants, publicists, set designers, family friends. And their stories, once fragmented, now form a pattern. The mask didn't slip. It was never real to begin with. One former assistant, anonymous, but verified, described her time working in the Reiner household in the early 2000s. He had two modes, she said, public and private. In public, Rob was jovial, approachable, always cracking jokes. In private, it was like walking on glass. You never knew what would trigger him. A dish out of place, a sound, even the way someone knocked. She claimed Rob held meetings in the viewing room, a private home theater that he referred to as the studio. He'd make Romy act out scenes, sometimes multiple takes, always under the guise of training. But these weren't auditions. There were no scripts, just direction. He'd say things like, look afraid, look innocent, cry harder. Then he'd film it. On tape. Old school camcorder style. When asked why no one said anything, she simply replied, because it's Rob Reiner. Who would believe me? One of the more chilling revelations came from a nanny who worked there for less than 6 months. She described Michelle Reiner, Rob's wife, as passive but always present. She wasn't cruel. But she didn't stop him, either. The nanny described being asked to leave the room during creative sessions with Romy, despite Romy's clear discomfort. I heard her crying once. Through the door. When I asked if she was okay, Michelle told me, Romy's just dramatic. The next day, the nanny was fired. Even some of Rob's Hollywood colleagues now admit they had suspicions. One actor, whose name we won't share due to legal reasons, recalled visiting the house for dinner in 2010. I walked into the living room and saw Romy sitting by herself, rigid. Rob was standing nearby, holding a glass of wine, just watching her. Not speaking, just watching. When asked about it, Rob allegedly smiled and said, she's learning how to sit with presence. Presence. That word would show up again. In journals. In leaked emails. Teach her presence. She lacks presence. Capture her presence. As if Romy were an object to be studied. Not a daughter. But what about Jake? Jake's silence wasn't just trauma. It was conditioning. In his second video, he talked briefly about his father's two faces. There was Rob. And there was the director. Rob made sandwiches. Told bedtime stories. Laughed too loudly. But the director? He gave notes. Always. Even in real life. Jake claimed his father once interrupted him mid-panic attack to say, that's not what fear looks like. Try again. That moment stuck with him for years. Because it wasn't just a cruel comment. It was a reminder that in their home, even pain had to perform. Then there were the tapes. We mentioned them before, the VHS tapes recovered from the locked cabinet in the Reiner estate. They were labeled like home videos. Christmas 2005. Playtime, Romy solo. Jake interview, 3rd grade. Nick behavioral correction. All innocent at a glance. But detectives, according to anonymous sources, described them as deeply disturbing. Not pornographic in the traditional sense, but cold. Controlled. Clinical. A family turned into a project. Children filmed during moments of vulnerability. Fear. Confusion. Punishment. And Rob's voice, always calm, always in control, narrating. Good. That's the emotion I want. Hold that expression. Jake, don't move your hands. It breaks the illusion. Romy, try to cry again. Louder this time. One former FBI profiler, brought in to review the tapes, said, "This wasn't art. This was psychological warfare." So how did he keep it all hidden? Simple. Rob Reiner was beloved. He wasn't a man. He was a myth. A progressive icon. A national treasure. And people don't question myths. Studios protected him. Friends protected him. Even the media, those who claimed to hold the powerful accountable, looked the other way. Because Rob Reiner made them laugh. Because he stood for the right things. On paper. But now, the paper was soaked in blood. And Michelle? She played the supporting role her entire life. But some believe she was the true mastermind behind the silence. A series of leaked emails from her account to a private lawyer revealed chilling priorities. We must control the narrative. Romy cannot speak publicly. Jake's podcast contacts must be neutralized. Nick is unpredictable. Leverage the trust clause if needed. She wasn't ignorant. She was strategic. One journalist compared Michelle to Lady Macbeth. Not the one screaming in guilt. The one pulling the strings. And the final piece? A document found in Rob's study, written in his handwriting, titled, "The Film in '01 Will See." It was a treatment, a screenplay outline. It detailed a story about a powerful director who manipulates his children into acting out a twisted morality play, all while the world worships him. In the final scene, the director is murdered, not by an enemy, but by his own creation. The last line of the script? "A father's legacy is what his children do with the silence." It wasn't art. It was a confession, and the world was finally listening. But what detectives uncovered next, hidden beneath the estate, in a tunnel never listed on the blueprints, would blow the case wide open, and no one was ready for what they found. If Rob Reiner wore the mask, who held it in place? That's the uncomfortable question at the center of this chapter. Because in every great deception, there's often someone in the background, not pulling the strings, but tying the knots, smoothing the edges, making the horror digestible to the outside world. Someone who sees everything and says nothing. That someone, in this story, is Michelle Reiner. Wife, mother, philanthropist, silent observer. But was she just complicit in Rob's madness? Or was she trapped in her own version of it? A woman broken so long ago that she couldn't see right from wrong anymore? Or worse, did she know exactly what was happening and help cover it up to preserve a dynasty built on lies? Let's dig into Michelle Reiner's role. And it starts long before the murders. Michelle Singer met Rob Reiner in the late 1980s. She was beautiful, intelligent, fiercely private. A political activist who preferred back channels to red carpets. Where Rob was loud and charming, Michelle was thoughtful and reserved. They married quickly. Too quickly, according to some close friends. One friend, who asked to remain anonymous, described Michelle as captivated but cautious in those early days. She wasn't dumb. She just chose to believe the better version of him. And for a while, that worked. They were a Hollywood power couple. They had money, access, prestige. They hosted fundraisers and mingled with presidents. But something changed after Romy was born. That same friend recalled. Michelle became withdrawn, protective, like a woman building invisible walls around her child. At first, people assumed it was just new mom anxiety. Now, it looks more like a warning sign. What did Michelle know? And when did she know it? Let's go to the emails. In the weeks after the murders, authorities accessed Michelle's personal account. Most messages were routine, charity updates, scheduling, social invitations. But then they found a folder titled Priv Files, Do Not Delete. Inside were emails between Michelle and a private crisis management firm dating back nearly 15 years. Subject lines included: potential exposure, Romy diary. Jake's blog, flagged language. NDAs for household staff, new draft. Romy talking to friend's therapist. Jake seen outside Cedars-Sinai, panic episode. These were not the emails of a woman unaware. They were the emails of someone monitoring a volatile secret, like keeping tabs on a volcano you know will eventually erupt. One especially chilling line from an internal draft read: if Romy ever leaks what happened in 2005, we're done. Suggest creating scholarship fund as soft cover. A scholarship fund. As a distraction. Not an apology. Not a correction. A shield. But was Michelle protecting Rob or protecting herself? That's the contradiction that makes her so hard to understand. Because people who knew her, staff, friends, even family, describe her in vastly different ways. Some called her cold. Others called her traumatized. One former housekeeper said, she wasn't a monster, but she was numb, like whatever love she had once was had been hollowed out. Another said Michelle always kept a lockbox in her closet, told everyone it was for jewelry, but it was filled with handwritten notes, most of them from Romy. Childhood notes. Scared notes. Please don't leave me alone with him. He said I'm not allowed to tell you. Mommy, I had a bad dream, but I was awake. She kept them. She read them, but she never did anything. Or she did something worse. Because buried deep in the estate's financial records was another secret. A monthly payment, $2,500, issued from a shell account to an unknown name. That name was eventually traced to a woman named Angela White. Angela worked at Romy's elementary school for 3 years. And in 2008, she filed a mandatory report with the school's counselor alleging that Romy had described inappropriate interactions at home. 2 months later, Angela resigned. 3 months later, she started receiving payments from a non-disclosed consulting firm, later revealed to be tied to Michelle's charitable network. Coincidence? Or a payoff? Angela never spoke to the media. She disappeared completely. But in 2023, a reporter tracked her down in Oregon. She declined to go on camera. But she said one thing, off record. I don't blame the kids. I blame the woman who was supposed to protect them. And then came the voice message. We touched on it before. 2 months before the murders, Michelle left a voicemail on her lawyer's phone. Here's the full transcript, now publicly verified. I don't care what they remember. It's too late now. We should have stopped it years ago. But we didn't. And now they're all turning on us. You think Jake's the only one who kept notes? Romy has boxes. Nick's unstable. They'll burn us all down. If she ever opens her mouth, we're finished. Finished. Not ruined. Finished. As if some unspoken force would bring the entire house down if even one of them told the truth. And maybe that's exactly what happened. Michelle's will provided one more twist. 3 days before her death, she made an emergency amendment. Romy was removed as a beneficiary. Nick's share was reduced by 70%. Jake, who had been excluded for years, was re-added, but not as a beneficiary, as a trustee. The document read, should the family structure collapse beyond recovery, Jacob is to be empowered to execute final estate protections. What does that mean? No one knows. The clause is vague, but some experts believe it was a contingency plan, one that assumed the inevitable, exposure, and that Jake, long thought to be the broken son, was secretly chosen to clean it all up. So was Michelle an enabler? Yes. Was she a victim? Possibly. But here's the truth no one wants to say. Sometimes silence is louder than screams. And in this case, Michelle's silence became lethal. Because in the days before her death, she knew the house of cards was wobbling. Jake had resurfaced. Romy was unraveling. Nick was slipping. And she was running out of time. The morning of the murders, Michelle made 2 phone calls. One to her lawyer, the other to Romy. The contents of that second call haven't been publicly released, but Romy told detectives afterward. It was like she was saying goodbye without saying it. But she never apologized. Not once. So was Michelle's death justice? Or just another casualty? That depends on how you define justice. But one thing is clear. Michelle knew. And knowing wasn't enough. Because what detectives discovered next, behind a false wall, in a tunnel no one even knew existed, would crack this case wide open. And when they opened that hidden door, what they saw would leave even seasoned FBI agents speechless. If walls could talk, the guest house would have screamed. It sat quietly behind the main estate, a modest one-story structure with ivy creeping up the sides and a broken porch light that flickered like it was too tired to stay on. From the outside, it looked like peace. But inside, it was war. Because while the Reiner family put on their show in the mansion, the smiles, the charity galas, the political virtue signaling, the guest house had become something else entirely. A vault of pain. A pressure cooker of memories. And, as investigators soon learned, a confessional. But not to police. To Jake. Because just days before the murders, Romy came there. Alone. And what she told Jake that night would change everything. Let's rewind to 3 nights before the murders. Jake had returned to LA quietly. No media, no public statement, just a burner phone and a couch in a friend's studio apartment downtown. He didn't even tell his siblings, not officially. But Romy knew. Maybe she felt it. Maybe she had a source. Maybe she never stopped tracking him. No one knows how she found out. All we know is this. She showed up. Late. Rain slicked the pavement. A rare storm sweeping across the hills. And when Jake opened the door, she was standing there. Soaked. Shaking. And carrying a shoebox. She didn't say hello. She didn't hug him. She just walked in and said, "I can't do this anymore." Jake didn't know what she meant. Not at first. But then she set the box down on the table. Opened the lid. Inside. Tapes. Cassette tapes. Mini D verses. Some labeled, others not. Some with years. Some just with one word. Cry. Control. Jake. Mom. Rehearsal 1. Finale. Jake stared at them. He didn't speak. Romy did. She began slowly. At first, it was just memories. Childhood things. How they used to hide in the linen closet when Dad got moody. How Jake once took a toy recorder and captured Rob yelling at Michelle through the intercom, then deleted it, terrified he'd be caught. How Nick once asked, innocently, why there were locks on the outside of their doors. But then her tone changed. Her eyes got darker, more hollow, and she said something Jake never forgot. "He made me lie on the bed." Jake's stomach turned. Romy kept going. "He told me it was a scene, that I had to help him finish the story. That if I loved him, I'd do it just like we rehearsed." Jake wanted to stop her. He didn't. She needed to speak. "And you saw it once. You were at the door. You looked. And then you left." Jake collapsed into the chair. He didn't remember that. He didn't want to. But he knew she was telling the truth. Because deep inside, buried under years of denial, he did remember. A flash. A scream. A door shutting softly. The guest house became a courtroom that night. No judge. No jury. Just 2 survivors and a box of evidence no one ever intended to see the light of day. Jake asked her why she was giving it to him. She said, "Because you're the only one who ever left. And now, I think you have to come back." He asked her if she'd told anyone else. She nodded. "Nick." Jake froze. "He already knows," she said. "He's the only one who doesn't pretend." And then she said something else. Something that would become critical in the trial later. "But he's not safe. Not when he's off his meds. And now that I told him, I think he's going to do something." Jake begged her to go to the police. But Romy refused. "You don't get it. They'll bury it. Dad has files on half the department. And Mom, she already started scrubbing my digital footprint. If I vanish tomorrow, it'll just look like I ran away. Again." So Jake offered to go with her. She smiled. "I don't need a shield. I need a witness." Then she pulled out one last tape. It was labeled, "The Day You Saw." Romy said it had been hidden behind a false panel in her childhood room. Jake held it in his hands. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "If you watch it," she said, "you'll stop wondering if it's real. If you don't, you can keep pretending." And then she left. No goodbye. No hug. Just a whisper. "Check the safe." Jake didn't sleep that night. He stared at the tape for hours. Considered destroying it. Thought about burying it in the desert. But just before dawn, he watched it. What he saw has never been fully described. Jake refuses to talk about it. The few detectives who viewed the footage call it damning, devastating, and a complete collapse of the Reiner family mythos. One officer, who later resigned, allegedly told a friend, "That wasn't a home movie. That was a manual. A guide on how to break a child." Jake turned the tape over to the authorities the next day. But the copy he gave them wasn't the only one. He kept a second copy, and he told exactly one person where it was hidden. His attorney, in a fireproof envelope marked, "If I disappear." That same morning, Jake returned to the guest house. He found something waiting for him. A note, folded neatly. It read, "I told Nick everything. If anything happens to me, you know what to do." Signed, Romy. 3 days later, Romy would make the 911 call, and her voice, splintered and raw, would echo across the dispatch system. "They're dead. They're dead. I told you he was dangerous. You have to check the basement. You have to check the..." Then silence. The call dropped, and the Reiner estate would never be the same again. So what was in the safe? Jake waited until after the murders to open it. He needed to know. And what he found inside. Not cash. Not jewelry. Not weapons. But letters. Dozens. All written by Romy. Never sent. Letters to Jake. To Nick. To her future self. To a therapist she never met. To a version of her mother that maybe never existed. They chronicled years of fear, of silence, of obedience. One letter read, "They say if you love your father, you forgive him. But what if you don't know who he really was?" Another said, "Sometimes I wonder if dying would be easier than talking. But then I remember, if I stay quiet, he wins." And one, dated just 2 weeks before the murders, ended with a single line. "If this is the last thing I write, please make it mean something." Jake did. He made it mean everything. He handed every letter over to investigators. He gave them the tapes. He gave them the guest house footage from his own camera, silent, but clear, Romy pacing, crying, whispering into her hands. But most importantly, he gave them the timeline, proof that Romy had warned him, proof that Nick knew, and proof that the events of that night weren't a random act of violence. They were a finale, a final scene written in secrets, directed by trauma, and performed by people who never got to choose their roles. But as damning as the tapes and letters were, they were nothing compared to what investigators found beneath the house, behind the locked wine cellar door, in a tunnel never listed in the blueprints, a place Romy had hinted at but never entered again, a place that Rob called the archive, a place even seasoned officers would later say should never have existed. And when the steel door creaked open and the flashlight beam hit the floor, they finally understood the depth of the Reiner legacy and the monsters it was built to protect. What's more terrifying than what people say, what they record and try to hide forever? The discovery of the hidden tunnel beneath the Reiner estate wasn't just a breakthrough in the murder investigation. It was the moment the entire case turned from a tragedy into a horror show. Because tucked beneath the $13.5 million mansion, behind a rusted, unmarked steel door, was a vault, a literal archive. And inside that vault, dozens of tapes, each one meticulously labeled, organized by year, by name, by scene. Some were cataloged with professional precision. Others were scrawled in shaky handwriting, as if whoever wrote them didn't want to remember what they were preserving. But someone did. Because these tapes weren't forgotten. They were hidden, buried in a place that Rob Reiner, the man Hollywood called a genius, had dubbed the archive. Not a wine cellar, not a panic room, not an editing suite. An archive, a place for keeping stories, even the ones no one should ever see. Let's talk about what the investigators found. There were 48 tapes in total. VHS, mini DVRs, even a few reel-to-reels, each marked with a number, a date, and a single word. Some examples: Romy solo, age 9. Jake interview, unscripted. Nick, intervention attempt 1. Mother watches. Training tape, presence. Finale, unfinished. And one that simply said, Jake witnesses everything. The FBI was brought in immediately, not because of the murder, but because of the nature of the content. A specialized task force, usually reserved for cult deprogramming cases and classified psychological warfare archives, was sent in to analyze what they called a disturbing, highly organized collection of staged emotional trauma involving minors. No official report has been released to the public, but multiple anonymous sources within the Bureau confirmed the following. The tapes show repeated coercion of the children. Romy appears in at least 15 of the tapes. Jake is featured in 9. Nick, in 6, but only as a background observer, never the focus. Michelle is seen in 4 tapes, always watching, never speaking. Rob's voice is heard in nearly every one, giving direction, criticism, or praise. But these weren't home videos. There was no laughter, no joy, just children being directed to feel, to perform, emotions most adults wouldn't dare fake. In one tape, labeled Presence Training, RR Solo, Romy is asked to sit in a chair, expressionless. Rob's voice off camera instructs her. Don't blink. Don't twitch. You're not scared. You're grateful. She's 8. She doesn't move. Then he says, now cry. She tries. He says, no. Real tears. I want it to hurt. Then silence. Until she breaks down, sobbing uncontrollably. The tape cuts to black. Another tape, Jake interview, unscripted, shows Jake, around 10, sitting on a stool. Rob's voice is calm, almost soothing. What do you love about your father? Jake hesitates. Rob presses. Say it. Jake murmurs something, inaudible. Then Rob asks, what would happen if you told the truth? Jake looks off camera and says, he wouldn't love me anymore. The most infamous tape. And the one that has never been shown, even in closed legal circles, is the one titled Jake Witnesses Everything. It is 43 minutes long and allegedly depicts the night that Jake walked in on something so horrifying it fractured his memory for decades. We still don't know what's in the full footage, but Jake has confirmed it was the night that changed him. The night Romy later referenced in the guest house. The night none of them ever spoke about again. Why did Rob keep these tapes? Power? Perversity? Pride? Some psychologists believe he was documenting a living script, a warped vision of family-as performance, an eternal rehearsal, a power fantasy where he was director, writer, and God. Others believe the tapes were insurance. Leverage. Because in Hollywood, secrets are currency. And Rob Reiner may have been holding a black market of shame in his basement, one that could keep everyone